Hey everybody, welcome back. This is the strings lesson in the variables unit in module 0. So the embedded video is going to be here. What are strings? A JavaScript string stores a series of characters. So definitely read through this. You can access an entire string or an individual character within it. And they're 0 indexed. And if you're wondering why, there's like a reason, but we don't really need to worry about it. We just need to remember that they start at 0. So we've got some test code, and we're going to go take it over to Replit and mess with it a bit. So here's our creation of a string. You can also just have like a string, just hanging out. In general, though, we're going to want to save them to either variables or parameters. On line 3, we're going to say first character variable, and we're going to assign it to be test string, which is this guy. Accessed, we use the square brackets to do that at, oh boy, back up. We're going to use the square brackets to do that, and we're going to do it at 0. So this actually accesses the first character, which is this one right here. Similarly, we're going to say third character, and we're going to assign it to test string at 2. So if we think this is 0, then this is 1, and this is 2. So that's going to access the third character, R, and save it to third character. So if we run the console.logs on line 5 and 6, we're going to log W and then R, and then again we'll keep seeing this undefined for reasons that are not really defined. Anyway, we'll go ahead and run. To be short, we defined this earlier. It's just the least important part about what's going on the page. What we want to focus on is this part, so that's why we had that moment of frivolity. Anyway, so W and R, let's go ahead and adjust these a little bit. If we change this to 3, and let's say we change this to 4, we'll run that again. Now, of course, we get D and S. Now, what would happen if we accessed it at 10? Now, there is no character at 10. It ends at 4, as we just saw. But if we try at 10, let's just see what happens. So we get undefined. Just something to kind of keep in the back of your mind. If we try to access a string at an index that is not part of the string, it's going to tell us that it's undefined there. So anyway, also, you don't have to have anything inside of a string to consider it a string. You can actually just wrap empty quotes around nothing, and we'll still have a string. So let's go ahead and start messing with some things. We'll go ahead and paste this on in there. And if we console.log empty string, this is going to be, well, let's change this back to 3. No, what do we want? We had 0, and we had 2 to access the first and third character. And then we've got an empty string, and we're going to run that. Now, you're just going to see kind of like a blank space. And the reason is because we're logging into the console. This is a moment where it doesn't really help us to log into the console, because if it's an empty string, you don't see anything, because it was like, okay, there's your empty string, and just kind of saves a line for it and then goes on about its business. You want to figure that there are cases where we might want to start with an empty string and then possibly like add something to it. So we could say string empty string is equal to empty string plus some new words. And then if we log it to the console, we're going to see that now we've added things to that string. However, if we were to leave this as undefined, as it would be if we didn't define it as anything, and then we ran this again, we may not get exactly what we want. Now, JavaScript is kind of weird like this, so it might help us out, but let's just kind of see what happens. So it says undefined there. So in the event that we would want to add portions of a string to an existing string, but we don't want anything before we get started, an empty string like this is going to allow us to do that. Now, this might seem kind of out of left field, but we want to keep in mind that what we're up to here is the same thing we've been up to the whole time. We've defined a new data type, the string, and now we're going to talk about some functions that interact with strings. If you don't get everything completely, don't worry about it. Just understand that this is where you would come back to for a very basic understanding of strings, how to create them, and how to access certain characters within them. Also, how to create an empty string. So, return values for functions and multiple parameters. So, we're going to walk through these the exact same way that we have them. Write this in here. First, we'll declare a function that takes in a string as a parameter and returns it. Very simple. Function takes a string here. We can call this anything. I'm calling it string just for simplicity's sake. But we could call this whatever we want. Then we return that string. So when we say variable result string is equal to return string, called with an argument of hooray for programming, the result of this function is just going to be to return this argument as defined in the definition. and then we're going to console.log two things. We're going to console.log result string plus a colon and a space. Actually, I don't think there is a space there. I'm going to put one. And then a comma, and then result string. Console.log will let you log multiple strings to the console, and it'll separate them by a space, which I guess is why I probably don't need that space there. So we've added a console.log message to help us identify which variable is which when this code is run in the console. Now, this would be the idea. Let's say we hear console.logging other stuff. It might help us to know that the result string is whichever the result string is. So if we hit run, we'll see that we get other stuff, and then we get a label for the actual result string. And as you see, it's just the argument that we passed in returned directly. Very simple idea. Now we're going to complicate things just a little bit, and instead of returning the entire string, our function that we're about to write is going to return just the first character. So if we think about that, this is the parameter. We want to access that parameter at the 0th index. So the first character variable here on line 5 is going to be set to a call to return first character with a argument of coffee. Console.log on line 6 is going to log first character as an identifier, and then the variable first character, whatever the value of that is going to be logged to the console. If we look through here, we see that the argument is coffee, which means that the first letter, or the first character, is going to be C. So this should say first character and then C. And we're in good shape. So let's go to the last one, and here's where we're going to start to get a little bit fancier than we have been previously. This is the first instance where we have two parameters. We have a string parameter and an index parameter. And what our function should do is it's going to take a string and a number parameter, and it returns the character located at the given index within the string. And looking back at this, we can see that in order to do that, where would we do that? We say the name of the string and then the number where we want to access that string. In this case, though, we don't have a number, we have a parameter that's going to stand in for a number. So we actually need to say string at index, the full word. On line, let's put it on line 6, we're going to say variable character, and now we're going to make a call to our return character function. So we got the definition here, and the definition operates largely on the parameters. Now we have a call to our function, which takes arguments. So the first argument, which is going to be bound to the string parameter, is t, and the index is and the second argument. Sorry, the first argument is t, a string. The second argument is 1, which is going to stand in for the index. So essentially, we're saying t at index 1, which should be e. So when we on line 7 console.log character, which is what we're saving the return value of this function call to. Oh boy, no, that's the identifier, and then the character. Okay, you should get it at this point. But anyway, we're going to console.log this, and it should get e to the console. If we were to change this, let's go ahead and make this t leaves, and let's access a character at index 5. So if we were looking for 5, it would be 0, 1, 2, the space counts as 3, 4, 5, of course it goes back to E. Let's make it 4. Anyway, 4 is hopefully going to give us L. So let's go ahead and log this one to the console. And as you can see, arguments are where we can kind of flex our function, which is to say that the function definition gives us some potential, calls to the function with specific arguments show us what actually happens when we run the function. So with that in mind, let's go ahead and, okay, one quick thing before we get to the challenges of this section, and it's something that's relatively important. So a variable is a named location for storing a value. Parameters could be considered relatively similar, and it's important to consider that this value is going to have a type. The name we choose can help or it can hurt, and so here are a bunch of examples of that kind of in practice. We could say variable count is equal to 9. Now this isn't perfect, but it's much better than something like variable whatever is equal to 6,398. It's like, what on earth does this mean? Maybe you were in the middle of writing a program and you understood what it meant at that moment, but if you come back to it in a couple of weeks, or if you're trying to show somebody else, naming a variable whatever is not really going to help anything. Now for strings, we could say variable name is equal to Charlemagne, which would help us understand that the name in the scenario is Charlemagne, or we could say variable something is equal to head chef. And okay, but something might be very, very difficult for us to understand later on. And the last one, Booleans, variable has been delivered. Now, Booleans are usually easy to name like this because if it's true or false, we ordinarily, or let's say we usually want to name our Boolean variables in such a way that they kind of tell you what they are. So this Boolean variable would tell us if something has been delivered or if it hasn't. So has been delivered is true, means that theoretically whatever needed to be delivered has been delivered. But if we say something like variable blah is equal to false, we're kind of shooting ourselves in the foot. Perhaps when we first wrote this we understood what it meant, but again, a couple of weeks down the road, maybe we're revising the code, somebody else is having a look at it, blah is going to not really inspire a bunch of confidence. We might even forget exactly what that's supposed to do because later on, the programs you're going to write and interact with are going to be way more complicated than what we're looking at now. So developing good habits when the simple stuff is a very good way to make sure that things don't get too hairy later on. So we've got our coding challenge, and these shouldn't be that difficult, but if they are, always just remember to return to the information previously listed. In general, the interactive documentation portion of this means that for the most part, almost all of the coding challenges you'll do will have the information required for it either in the same lesson or at least in this module. So if we think about it, we're going to complete a function that takes two parameters, a string and a number. We'll refer to an index within the string. The function should return the character within the string located at the given number index. So let's scroll up here and we see that here is an example of just that, return string at index. This is going to get the job done for us. So we'll copy this using Command C. We're going to come down here to the coding window and paste it in there. Then we'll go ahead and hit run tests. So it should return string character at given index. It should return string character at other given index. Now, exactly why this is the case, you're going to notice that some of the automated tests will have multiple tests, and some of them will only have one or two. And the idea is to make sure that you don't hard code. Now, hard coding would be something like this. First, we're going to change this to just return nothing, and then we're going to hit run tests. So it should return string character at given index, expected false to deeply equal true. And essentially what's going on here is that the tests are coming back false when they're supposed to come back true. Now, this might not be entirely obvious. In fact, there's probably no way that you'd be able to know this. But what you can do is you could say something like return n. Because, hey, maybe that's the character that they want. If I run this, I see that I actually passed the first test. Because the first test is checking to see a case where what should be returned from the function is actually the letter n. Now the reason that there are two tests here is to kind of prevent this idea. This is not a good idea. We don't necessarily want to try to figure out what the tests are looking for and then code to them. In general, that's defeating the purpose of the test. So in this case, we're going to access the string, which is our parameter, at our index parameter in index. We run this test and we're back in good shape. So the next unit that we're going to be on is called objects. It's going to have two sections, arrays and objects, and both of those we could consider something called collections of data. Now, previously we were talking about scalar data types, and that's basically what we've gone over so far. You want to consider that collections are essentially collections of either other collections or, more likely for our introductory purposes, scalar values. If all of that didn't make sense, don't worry about it at this point, provided that you were able to successfully navigate the documentation to create an answer for this function. You've done everything that you need to at this point, and you've done an excellent job of it. So thanks very much for watching this video. Hope you're enjoying it, and we'll see you in the next one.